Welcome back to the Obsession Engineering Garage. In the last episode we split the crankcases on our s1000rr rebuild and we took the crank out. This time I'm going to do some measuring. The first thing I'm going to do is measure with Plastigauge the bottom end bearing clearances to see if we require bearing replacement. I'm also going to inspect the gearbox, check that's okay, and then we'll know what we need to order to put the engine back together. I'm actually going to do the gearbox inspection first, because once I've checked that it's easy because I can actually leave half the gearbox out of the cases and it makes it a little bit easier to do some of the other jobs. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to pull this gear cluster out of the cases, and then I'm going to put it on the bench and I'm going to inspect the driving dogs between the gears and the teeth themselves. I'm going to do the same with the other cluster that remains in the bottom end of the engine. If everything actually looks okay, then I don't really need to take the gearbox out, which saves time and money. As you can see, I've got the gear cluster, this is the output shaft, on the bench. What I'm really looking for is this face here, down here. I want to make sure that that edge is still nice and sharp, because if that sort of starts getting rounded off, that affects how much drive the gears can have, because what happens is the gear selector sits in here and it pushes the gear across into that gear, and then together they drive forwards. So we need to make sure that this face here, this edge here, and the equivalent edge in here is a nice sharp finish, a nice sharp edge to it, so that it will grip. If they start to like curl off around the edges, that's when the gears will push apart from each other and the bike will try and jump out of gear. I'll also double check all of the ones in here and make sure all the dogs are good. I'll have a look, make sure all the teeth look okay, and I'll have a look at the selector forks, make sure they're okay. If everything else looks okay, I don't tend to take this shaft out of the engine just to check this selector. The selectors aren't really known for wearing in these BMWs, and there's been no shifting issues reported. So all I'd do potentially by taking this apart is disturb more items that don't need disturbing. So that can actually stay in the cases. The gearbox appears to all be in tip-top condition, so the next thing I'm going to do is measure the clearances for the big end shells, and that involves us using a thing called Plastigauge. And what that is a really, really thin little strip of basically soft plastic, and what you do is you put the crank back in the engine, you lay the Plastigauge on the crank, you clamp the two halves of the rod bolt together, and you torque them up to the correct torque setting. So I'm going to keep using the old rod bolt for this. So we're going to torque them up, and the Plastigauge will squash down, and then you take the cap back off again and you measure the Plastigauge, and that tells you what clearance you have in the bearing. So this little strip here is the Plastigauge. So now that that's in place, I need to put the rod bolt cap back on, tighten the bolts up to the correct torque level, then undo them again and take the cap back off, but I cannot have the crank rotate at all while I'm doing this, so I have to be quite careful. Because I've got the crank in the position where these two, this number 1 and number 4 at the highest point, I shall do number 1 and number 4, do them all, measure them, and then I'll turn the crank around and do 2 and 3. So now you can see that it's squashed all this Plastigauge down, and that gives us our very accurate clearance. So what we then do is compare it to the sheet of paper we've got. It's bigger than that. I don't know. Right, so I know the clearance there. We'll move down this end. Yep, okay. Right, I will then, measure those a little bit more accurately when I'm not holding a camera in the other hand, and then I will clean them up and do the bearings number 2 and 3, and then I will know where we are. I've measured all of the big end clearances and they're all almost identical and they're all well within the tolerance that I would expect from one of these engines. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the main bearing clearances in exactly the same way. I'm going to put plastic gauge on each one. I'm then going to put the other half of the crankcase on, bolt the bolts up. That makes more sense. And same again, bolt it together, unbolt it, take the case half off, measure the clearances, and then I'll know exactly what bearings require ordering. So as you can see here, we've got the plastic gauge nicely squashed down. So what I'm going to do is go down each bearing, measure the plastic gauge, and then I can work out exactly what bearings are in and out of tolerance, and then I can have a chat with the owner and see exactly what they want to replace. Simple as that. So now that I've measured all the stripped down items, I've got all the bottom end clearances, valve clearances, cam timing, leak down test, etc. I can now have a chat with the owner and decide what parts we're going to replace with it. There's actually not going to be a massive parts bill on this because it is not worn out, because it's not done much mileage. So the next time you see me, hopefully I will either have some parts or I'll be taking valves out of a cylinder head. Thanks for watching.